My name is Brenda Bass, also known as Brenda Bass Roper, and I was born in Goldsboro, North Carolina, February of 1951.
Thank you.
That adds up to 27 years. Just, yeah. Yes.
Good.
Yes.
So let's start with your family, and you can go back as far as you'd like. But basically, so North Carolina.
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about your maybe grandparents and then come forward to your parents and just who are they, what were they about?
My father's parents, my grandmother, I knew better than all the other grandparents. My other grandparents I didn't know as well. My grandmother was probably about 15 years old when she married and had maybe a 6th grade education. And she married my grandfather, who was about 10 years older than she and was a minister. So he had some formal education. The two of them had 11 children. My father was the 3rd youngest of that brood. And amazingly, even with her 6th grade education and with her job as a domestic, she worked in a cafeteria at the local hospital in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And my grandfather died when my father was 5 years old. So my grandmother, on her own, with these 11 children, provided an atmosphere that just required education. All of her children were expected to become educated. And how she did it, I do not know. But I had 10 aunts and uncles who I guess from the 1930s maybe onward, all went to college. And they all helped the child below them go to college. Amazing. So that's my dad's side of the family. My mother's mother was from Raleigh, North Carolina, which is a little bit bigger town than Goldsboro. And she was a college-educated woman who was a teacher. And her husband, my grandfather on my mother's side, was a brick mason. So I think he had an apprenticeship, but I don't think he had a formal education. And the two of them, my grandmother and grandfather, had one child, my mother. And so my mother and her family moved from Raleigh to Goldsboro because of my dad's work because of my grandfather's work. And it was in the 9th grade that my mother met my father. And they claim that they were friends in the 9th grade, and then they became boyfriend and girlfriend maybe in the 10th grade. And my dad went to college, my mother went to college. They reconnected during college and they got married. And so that was the framework.
Back to your grandmother,
yes,
who had the 10 children?
11, yes.
11.
Yes.
She put them all through university.
She didn't by herself, but it was her spirit.
But she,
yes,
made sure.
She made sure. So the oldest child went to college, had a job. The second oldest would have a job during high school. So then that person saved money, and then the person's money that they'd save money, and then they would have enough money to go to school. Then the next child had saved money. My father tells a story, and of course I wasn't there, so I don't know if this is really true, but it's a great story. When in my father's town in Goldsboro, there was, I don't know the name of the street, I think it was Slocum, which separated the black neighborhood from the white neighborhood. Because of course my father, who was born in 1926, grew up in segregation. The grocery store that served the community was, of course, owned and operated by a white person, a white man. My father, at around maybe 10 years of age, had already secured a paper route and had 3 other young fellas working for him on this paper route. Very entrepreneurial. And he decided to speak to the owner of the grocery store about providing delivery service. So the owner of the store said, "That sounds like a really good idea. Do you have a bike to be able to deliver?" And my dad said, "No. But if you say that you will hire me, I can convince Mr. whatever his name was who owned the bike shop to sell me a bike on a layaway plan." So my dad, with no bike, only an idea, convinces the grocer that he will be the delivery man, goes to the man who owns the bicycle store, gets a bicycle, and now has 2 businesses. So at 11 or so, he is has the newspapers and he has this grocery business.
In a segregated community.
In a segregated community, right. Yes.
So then your parents, we now had how many children?
They had 2 children.
2 children.
I have 1 sister who's 2 years younger than I am.
Okay, and your mother and father, what did they do?
And my mother, for most of her life, was a housewife. I think maybe for 2 years she worked, that I can recall. We lived in Africa, and during that time my mom worked at a bank when we were living in Africa. And we were living in Liberia, Monrovia, Liberia. Yeah, my dad was in the military for 23 years, and he was military attaché to the president of Liberia, which is why we were in Liberia. And it was during that time that my mom had a job. But before and after that, I don't recall her working. She was a housewife.
How old were you when you moved to Liberia?
I was in the 5th grade.
Oh,
so
what was that like?
I had been convinced by television that Africa was filled with jungle creatures and jungle animals. So I expected Tarzan when I opened the plane door. And I was shocked that there was no Tarzan. Obviously, that is how America saw Africa. So of course, there were educated people, professors, scientists, businessmen. And it was a culture of multicultural society, actually, because there were Indians, there were people from Lebanon, there were people from Iran, there were people from all sorts of places who lived there. And as a child, I think you're struck by, I was struck by certain things, as in America, we didn't have a chauffeur, we didn't have a cook, we didn't have a housekeeper, we didn't have those kinds of amenities. But in Africa we did. And we learned, obviously, that in lots of foreign countries, people have people that help them in their homes. So that was a different kind of experience.
You went to what kind of a school?
We went to an international school, so that the U.S. Embassy, in coordination with other embassies from other countries, had a school. So I went to school with kids who were similarly situated. Their parents were there. They were American kids, except for 1 or 2 dignitaries from the Liberian government whose children attended school with us.
Did you have any problems with racism in that school?
In that school, no.
No.
None that I can recall.
Yeah.
No.
So that must have been really a different...
It was an adventure.
Yes.
Yes.
Very different from life in the U.S.
Yes. We would go, in the United States, during that time, black people didn't wear sunscreen because we didn't know, because we weren't at the beach. When we lived in Liberia, we wore sunscreen every day because we were being beaten by the sun, in that experience. But we went to the beach every day, so that we had that beach experience that was, and Liberia sits near the equator, so it was very hot. We had never seen the lizards that, are often in these tropical climates that are living in your home with you. So that was kind of a shock in the beginning. And then you realize they are there to eat the insects, so that's a good thing. Breakfast included anti-malarial tablets. That was different. We had filtered water. These are all things that I remember from, that
Beaches
experience.
were segregated in North Carolina?
Beaches in North Carolina? I would assume so. I
But
didn't
you
live
weren't
there,
close
so
enough.
I didn't know.
You weren't close enough to go.
Right.
Yeah.
We didn't go to the beach
Yeah.
in North Carolina until I was an adult.
Sure. So, can you say a little bit about African Americans in the military? Because your father joined in the
Let's see, he joined in the 40s, I
40s,
guess.
okay.
Yeah. So he was 19 when he was drafted.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
He then went to Korea and then did ROTC and did officers training school and then was an officer in the Army. So that while during his tenure, I guess he was just on the other side of the Army becoming integrated. However, because my dad was an officer, the officers were segregated from one another, not white from black, but from non-commissioned officers and officers.
So rank.
So by rank, yes. So we would be the only black family, or one of two black families, who lived in the officers' quarters, who went to the officers' club, who...
But by that time, the military, well, it wasn't fully desegregated, was it?
I don't know the year at which it was fully desegregated, but I was born in the 50s, so by the time I was born and would know anything about it, it was not segregated, yes.
Okay. And so growing up in your family, was there much experience with racism?
On the way over here, I was just thinking about that. Obviously, in my parents' lives, there was much more that than was in my life or in my sister's life. Because my dad was in the Army, and because we lived primarily on Army bases, I really didn't experience firsthand segregation. I experienced it indirectly. I'd hear stories. So that we would go to visit my grandmother, and we would drive from Kansas, or we would drive from Maryland
to North Carolina.
And I remember saying, "Daddy, can we stop and get ice cream?" Because there was Howard Johnson's that sold ice cream along the way. And my parents would just very calmly say, "Oh, we can't, we don't have time. Your mom packed a lunch. We'll get some ice cream when we went to Grandma's." It was just very low key, no big deal. I did not know until I was an adult that the reason we didn't stop at the Howard Johnson's was because we couldn't, that we were not permitted. But I didn't experience that directly. And I didn't know it. So that I think my parents intentionally made an informal or formal pact with each other to say, you know what, we're going to act like everything is fine, which is what they did, and spared us the negativity. Now, when we'd go to my grandmother's, I remember seeing places, and my father would say, when I was a kid, we couldn't go there. Or there was a barbecue place, And the person who owned the barbecue place was a very fair-skinned, could pass for white black man who had a restaurant. He'd made the decision that he would allow white patrons to come in the restaurant, and because they didn't want to be with black patrons, that he would only serve black patrons in a pickup kind of situation. So the black people weren't allowed in the restaurant, but he was black.
What was the pickup kind of situation?
Well, you could order.
Ah.
So you'd order food,
To
and
take
you'd go
away.
to a back window,
Ah.
drive. You would just drive up, pick
Yeah.
up your food, but
But
you
could-
couldn't sit in the
Yeah.
restaurant.
Yeah.
And I remember my dad saying that we wouldn't be going to have any of that barbecue.
Interesting.
Yes.
So you went to high school in,
So I started high school in Virginia.
well, I'm sorry, elementary, junior,
So
high
elementary, I was in Africa.
school. Okay, yes.
So I was in Africa 5th grade.
Right.
I was in Africa for the 5th and the 6th grade. I was in various states in the United States before then. I lived in Germany also.
You're an army child.
I'm an Army brat. We lived many places. 2 years here, 3 years there. Don't get too attached to anybody because you have to tell them bye-bye. And then when I went to junior high school, when we came back from Africa, I went to a segregated school for the first time
Where?
in Virginia.
19?
So this would have been, let's see, I'm 12. So this would have been like 63, something like that.
Not a good time in Virginia.
Not a good time in Virginia. So I went to a school in Norfolk, Virginia, for a year. And then I went to, because my dad was stationed in Norfolk. Then he was relocated to Fort Monroe, which was in Hampton, Virginia. And so then we moved to Hampton, which is just 15, 20 minutes away, but a different city. And then I went to a 7th and 8th grade at a segregated school.
What was that like?
In the very beginning, it was very hard.
Can you explain that?
Sure. It was hard because kids made fun of me by the way I talked. You know, they said I was trying to be white. You talk like a white person. Well, I had come from an environment where I was pretty much the only black child. And so people picked on us. And the nuance, the way that black people interact with one another is different than the way that black people interact with white people. And so I didn't know how to code switch like that. I only knew how to act around white people. So
So you were not,
I was picked on.
yeah,
I wasn't black enough.
which must have been confusing.
It was
or-
very
or
confusing.
Confusing, okay.
And painful.
Painful.
And painful. And
Did you speak to your parents about this?
and I think I did, and the sentiment that I remember the most is, as people get to know you, they'll see you for who you are, and everything will be okay. So,
And from when you returned from Liberia, we're not talking junior high?
we're talking elementary. I returned.
You
I was
did
in the 6th grade, and
sixth
then
grade.
getting ready to go to the
To
7th.
junior, and then were you
Right.
still? It was always segregated schools until end of high school. or-
No.
no.
So then, at the end of 8th grade, a new school had been, a relatively new school had been built in
You're in
Hampton.
Virginia.
And I'm in Virginia. I'm in
Okay.
Hampton.
Okay.
And one had the choice of attending the predominantly black school or the predominantly white school.
What did your parents
And-
decide?
And they sent me to the predominantly white school.
And how was that?
And it was very interesting. Some of the same problems of being picked on, being made fun of, were also evident then.
Predominantly from the whites?
Both sides.
Both sides, okay.
Both sides.
Okay.
So I had black kids who would say, "Why are you talking and sitting and having lunch with this white person? Why aren't you, you should be over here with us." Because in the cafeteria, for instance, most of the black kids sat together and most of the white kids sat together. And I would sit with my new friends, some of whom were white. So the black kids would pick on me, and then there were the white people who wanted to know, why did I think I needed to be over here with the white people?
They gave you a hard time.
Yeah, well, but it was all verbal. It was nothing.
But verbal.
But verbal, yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And after maybe the first year of being at the school, I joined the yearbook staff. I was in the a cappella choir. I found a community that was willing to, of black students and white students, who became my friends. And then it was great. I think back, and it was a good, I have fond memories of high school. Although I do have some, little incidents that I do recall.
Anything with teachers?
No.
No. Were you, would you take a bus to school?
Yes. Because I lived near Hampton University, and there were some children of faculty members of Hampton who went to Kicquetan, and I lived near the campus. My parents arranged for me to ride that bus. And so I rode a bus with black kids, predominantly, across town to the white school.
Okay. But it was a high school, you really found your community.
I found my community. I mean,
yes.
I ran for office. I was
Yes.
on the student council. I did all the things, I did all the things that.
But you lived on a base, on an army base. No?
Not then. My
Not
dad and my parents bought a house, and we lived not on an army base.
Okay.
That was the first time we had lived in a house that was ours. Yes. In Virginia, in Hampton.
Hampton.
Yes. Up until then, you're right. We had lived.
Were you in a white neighborhood?
No, we were near Hampton Institute, near Hampton University. They changed the name
Yes.
some years ago, and I still call it what it used to be.
Sure.
But we lived in a community that I thought was the way everybody lived. An architect lived next door to me. Arthur Ashe's tennis teacher was one of my neighbors. 2 faculty members from Hampton lived next door. A pediatrician lived across the street. A retired.
But there was a black community.
And it was a black community, yes. And I thought that's what black communities look like. I didn't.
But it was a good community.
No, it was a fabulous community, right? Yes.
And there was all kinds of support.
And
there
there
was a church. There was
Yes.
There were all these professionals. There were also other folks that lived there.
Yes.
I mean, labor and other. But it was a good community.
It was a great community.
Close
right.
knit.
Yep.
Yeah.
hmm And one of our neighbors, who lived across the street from me, had 3 daughters. And because I had been an Army brat and had moved from place to place, when we moved to Hampton, I had a friend. I met this girl across the street, who to this day is one of my dearest friends, because I was old enough then to be able to keep in contact with somebody. And, she and I went to, kept in touch. She went to graduate school. I went to, she was a couple years ahead of me, and we have remained good friends. So that was the other benefit of living in that wonderful neighborhood.
Arthur Ashe has come up
Yes.
in several interviews.
Isn't that interesting?
Isn't that interesting?
Ah,
So I'm going to ask you a little
Sure.
bit. And I don't. So Arthur Ashe, was he the first tennis player, black, to break the barriers,
I believe so.
right?
I believe so.
That's sort of the impression I
Right.
get.
My great uncle was one of his first tennis teachers. And I don't think my great uncle was identified as somebody who played as well as Arthur Ashe. But
And where was your great uncle?
he lived in Washington, D.C.
And that's where he coached
Yes.
Arthur Ashe?
Yes.
Because he was from Washington.
He was from, well,
from-
he might have been from Virginia, but I'm not sure.
Okay. And,
But my next door neighbor, so my uncle, my great uncle, taught Arthur Ashe. Was one of his teachers, and then my next door neighbor, who happened to have been an architect and a tennis buff, also had played with Arthur Ashe.
where
Yes.
would black people play tennis?
Wherever they could. So that at Hampton, on the campus, there were tennis courts at the university,
And that was allowable?
and that was allowable. My dad played tennis probably until he was 80 years old. So at one, I mean, after he retired from the Army, he joined a Fortune 500 company and became a business executive. And so then he had access to some, fancier places to play tennis. But as a child in segregated Goldsboro, they took space where they could find it, and somebody had a tennis ball and they'd erect a net, so you played where you could. That's what I meant by that.
Interesting that Arthur Ashe. Okay.
Has come up, yeah.
And then what happened after high school?
So
parents are living in
parents are living in
Virginia.
and my father retired from the military. So then my dad retired as a colonel, and then my dad interviewed with some private organizations because he was a young man. He was 43 years old at this point or something like that. And he was offered a position at R.J. Reynolds. So he took that position and became like the most senior black person to work at that company and was on their executive board and et cetera, right?
In Virginia.
North Carolina.
Now back
to North
Sorry,
Carolina.
okay.
No worries, yeah.
It is
So we moved to
It is a
Winston-Salem.
military family.
Yes. So we moved from Virginia to Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Okay.
That's the headquarters of R.J. Reynolds.
Okay. And you were how
And
old?
I had just graduated from high school.
High school.
So for the summer, I had a summer job at my dad's company. I typed on an old-fashioned typewriter for one of the executives. His secretary was on vacation, so I became a secretary. And then I went to college that September.
And high school, you must have whizzed right through it.
I did very well, yeah. I mean, my parents, without being anything other than, it was clearly expected. There was just, my parents made it clear I can't recall how young, that at some point you'll be an adult and at some point you'll need to take care of yourself. In order to do that, you will go to college and you will have a career and you will.
That was the expectation.
It was the expectation. Just like you're breathing, you will go to college. So we breathed and then we went to college. Exactly.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Fisk University, which is and that was great. And given the fact that I had spent this time prior in predominantly white schools, and then I had that 2-year interlude in an all-black school, and then I went to an integrated school for high school. It was really a good idea for me to forge my real identity and to really connect with my blackness, that I went to a black school. So I had an opportunity to, to have that experience, which just then fortified
So it was good.
who I am. Yes, it was
You
great.
loved it.
It was great.
And what did you study?
I studied psychology, and my original plan was that I was going to get a PhD in psychology. I was awarded a Thomas J. Watson Foundation Fellowship. I think the founder was from the founder of IBM, I think, started this foundation. And you were able to travel abroad for a year. You wrote a paper about what it is you might want to study during that year, and then there were some interviews and people were selected. Fortunately, I was selected, and so for a year I was in Ireland, England, and then I went to Sierra Leone, I went to Accra, Ghana, I went to Dar es Salaam. I had an amazing year abroad, and I was writing a paper about looking at IQ as it relates to cannabis smoking. So this is in the 60s. This is early 70s now. And interestingly, my research showed that for the most part, if your IQ was higher, you were willing to participate in the smoking of weed.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I wouldn't have expected that.
Exactly. But while I was away, I met all kinds of people. Some people who were students like I was studying abroad. I met musicians. I met, people who worked for the State Department, just all kinds of people. People who lived in these places permanently, expats, etc. And I met a man who was a lawyer who said, if I had to do this all over again, I wouldn't go to law school, I would go to medical school. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, well, if I could find a job wherever, because it would allow me to be employed or be self-employed anywhere in the world. I could satisfy this desire I have to help people. And it would just be a great thing. And I heard him say these things, and I said, perhaps I need to think about this differently, Of course, I wanted to impress him, so I said, I think I'll do this too. And so as it turned out, I never saw that guy again, but I then came back to the United States. I went back to college, yes.
And went into pre-med?
And then I had to take the pre-med courses,
yes.
Right? And then I was accepted into medical school, and then I went to medical school.
Where?
In Boston University.
Very nice.
Yes.
What was Boston like for you?
I arrived in Boston a couple of days before the segregated schools in Boston were having a big riot. So the headline in the newspaper was "Bus Overturned by Rioters." So some black kids from one part of Boston were being bused to another part of Boston, and the people who were from the community to which those other kids were coming, those people were not happy. And I don't think anybody was killed, but awfully scary. Yes, it was pretty ugly. And Boston was a very segregated kind of town. It wasn't legally segregated, because now we're talking 1970. But there clearly was animosity.
The Irish, the Protestant, these very, and
Yes.
then of course the African-American
Yes.
community.
Yes.
Yeah. And so did you experience anything that wasn't pleasant in Boston?
Not particularly,
No.
that I can recall. No.
And medical school was good?
And medical school was good. Medical school was hard.
Yes.
And
Were there
probably because there were 20 or 25 black kids that went to medical school with me, we self-segregated to have study groups and et cetera, and to support each other. during that time.
Was it harder because you were black at that time?
I think there were some faculty members who thought in general, that black kids didn't belong there. And so that I think that there was some more difficulty for us.
Did you feel they would be harder on you than the other students?
Personally?
You and the blacks. Did you feel that the faculty who were prejudiced
yes.
So they would do things?
There would be some, I can't think of any slights in particular.
Sure.
But I recall feeling that if I were white, this wouldn't be happening to me. Now, I was in the elevator one day, and one of the professors was also in the elevator. And he made a remark, and the remark was something like, "You must not be studying because you look too well put together." Now, is that sexist? Is that racist? What is that? I don't know. But it was clearly something. Combination, because even though my medical school, Boston University, started out as a women's medical school and then accepted males, but there were people who thought that women didn't belong there in the 70s. And then there were people thinking, well, you're a woman and a black person, you've taken up 2 spaces. 2 other people could have been in your space. So while I didn't have any specific incidents, I remember having that feeling that I'm just now remembering,
And did your black classmates do okay?
Most of them did.
Good.
Most of them did, yes.
And then you specialized? You did. So
and then you
get
do
your
you do an internship and a residency.
Right. Okay.
And that's when you pick a specialty.
And where was internship?
Internship was at Children's Hospital.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, here in Los Angeles.
Oh, okay.
That's what brought me here.
Ah.
Yeah.
Why did you come here?
Purely for the weather.
After Boston.
I was in Boston in the winter, and I came to UCLA to do an elective because you could do a month outside of your institution, right?
Yeah.
And I had parked my car in the indoor garage specifically because it was going to be snowing, and I didn't want to come back to a snow-covered car. I came to California, and people had on sleeveless in November. And I said, oh my gosh. And I have a cousin who lives here, and he had people for dinner. And he had the air conditioning on and the fireplace going for the ambiance. Yes. And I said, oh, this is my kind of place. And so I I matched with Children's Hospital. Yes, so part of it was the weather.
And so that was internship?
That was internship, and then I did 2 years of residency, pediatric residency at Children's.
At Children's,
right,
okay.
Yes.
And then you stayed?
And then I was an ER doctor, yep. And then I decided to have a private practice, and yes, I've been here ever since.
But you were a pediatrician ER doctor?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
right.
In a pediatric hospital.
In a pediatric, and then you
and then I
set
opened
up
an
your
office.
own office?
Yes.
And, yes, okay.
Yes.
So, now, as an African American coming to Los Angeles, what's that like? In other words, what's the community here like?
Los Angeles, as you know, is very spread out, and there are pockets of communities. And I think for somebody who comes to this city, it's a little bit difficult to figure out where are your people and how do you find them. So that unlike other cities, like New York, for instance, or Chicago, there are places where people hang out And you have an opportunity then to meet like-minded people, you know, or the professional people, or whoever the people, the group is that you're looking for. In Los Angeles, it's a little bit more difficult because the place is so spread out. So that I think it's much more by chance, unless you're lucky enough to have friends who say, oh, my friend is there,
Yes.
reach out to that person.
Right.
The medical community here is relatively small, given how large Los Angeles is. So that even at Cedars, which is my affiliated hospital, there are just a handful of us, a handful of African-American
Yes,
doctors who are
yes.
associated with the hospital. And I'm not really sure how many African Americans apply to the medical staff and don't get accepted, or if people just think, because this is a city that I have patients who have told me that they had not traveled in Los Angeles. They've lived in Los Angeles their whole life, and they had not traveled north of Olympic except to come to my office. That part of town they have no knowledge of. And maybe they live in South Central, maybe they live in Lancaster, maybe they live in Inglewood, but that they don't come north, which is fascinating. And I guess it's probably not as uncommon as I'm thinking it is. Probably there are people in other big cities that, whatever the dividing line is, don't make that.
So the dividing line is still there.
Yes, there is a dividing line
Yeah.
still there.
Even
right.
though, you know,
Yes.
there's supposedly things are getting better.
Yes,
Or
yes.
were getting better.
Yes, yes.
Depending on
who's doing the talking and where
we're
you
talking
were.
about.
Yes.
So let's see. I also want to. I'm looking at my notes because I don't want to miss anything.
Sure.
So you moved out to LA, and did you set up a family here, or?
So I did it. Ooh, we can scratch all that. I did ultimately, as I finished up my residency, and I started going out with a man, and he and I decided to get married, and we then had 2 children. And so my husband passed away, and he was a investment advisor, stockbroker, and we had 2 beautiful children who are now young adults.
And how did your children? What are they doing now?
So I have a son who lives in Philadelphia, who just recently was accepted to business school. So he's coming back west. I'm very excited.
Good.
Yeah. And my daughter is in the diversity, equity, inclusion space at a bank in New York. She's been in New York for 12 years. Yeah. So my kids are thriving and doing very well, and I'm very proud of them.
And in your practice in LA, since you moved out here, who are your patients?
I feel so blessed to have such an interesting, every day is a different day in my office. I have patients who have had to borrow money from me to take the bus to get home. I've had people who don't want anyone else in my office at the time that they bring their children because they are either celebrities or dignitaries or whatever, and everybody in between. I have patients who only speak Vietnamese. I speak no Vietnamese. And through sign language, we have figured out how to communicate. I have learned Spanish from being a resident. When I was in training, we had translators, but you had to wait for the translator. So obviously, you have patients to see, and you want the patient to get the care they need. So you first do some sign language, and then you start learning. So I can take a medical history, and I can have a pretty good conversation with you in Spanish. I've never taken a day of formal Spanish class, but I learned from my patients. So I have patients who only speak Spanish. I have patients who only speak Vietnamese. I have patients who travel long distances to come see me. I have patients who fly in to see me. I have a very mixed group of patients, which makes it very satisfying. Yes, yes.
And so you've had a wonderful, successful practice.
Yes, I have.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's wonderful.
yeah.
And do you do any kind of mentoring, pardon me, of African-American medical students?
I have periodically, but again, there haven't been that many
You're right.
to. Uh huh.
Why do you think that is? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think that it's very expensive now to go to medical school. Because of the expense, most people who are finishing up medical school now want to go work for an organization, not like in a private practice like mine, because they have bills they want to take care of. And in a private practice, you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to defer making money in the beginning because you've got to build this practice, in contrast to getting a salary if you're working somewhere else. So I think that's part of it. And because I'm affiliated with a hospital that now no longer even has a residency program. There were pediatric residents at Cedars, and now there aren't any. So that hospitalists are taking the place of what the residents did. So my exposure then
Yes.
is more limited now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I've been asked by Malik to ask you.
Okay.
It might be interesting to ask her about the role of religion plus faith in growing up and throughout her life.
My parents were raised, as so many black families were, as Baptists. And my dad, at around the age of 12 or 13, became acquainted with a man who was Episcopalian. And my dad really looked up to him. He was one of his teachers at his high school, I believe. And he started going to church at Mr. Brown's church, yes. And then he became more interested in the Episcopalian tradition and the religion and its inclusivity and et cetera. And so my dad then became Episcopalian. And then my mother and I took we have classes just like they do with Catholicism. Mm-hmm. So that we, together, my mother and I, took the classes when I was in high school. And we converted to Episcopalianism as well. And I definitely call myself a woman of faith. And I am sure, I'm about to cry, it has provided me with, particularly during my husband's illness and then death, and the raising of my children, the kind of foundation and support, in addition to my family, that allowed me to, yes.
So faith is a very important
Yes.
factor in life.
Yes.
It's gotten you through some very difficult times.
It's gotten me through difficult times, yes.
Isn't that wonderful
Oh, absolutely.
to have that?
Absolutely. I'm good.
You're okay.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
thank you.
And I just...
And through COVID.
please talk about that.
Yeah. Which is, of course, why I'm wearing this mask. It is but by the grace of God that we are in this room alive. Because this has been a horrible medical challenge, you know.
I can't imagine
yes,
that part.
yes.
I mean, I tried to picture what it must be to work in a hospital with all these patients and the chances of their
Yes.
survival, especially in the early
days. And I'm reminded that when we first, maybe in beginning of March of 2020, when COVID was clearly identified, but it hadn't been embraced as necessarily this disease that we knew what to do with. Everybody was running in 20 different directions and nobody knew what to do, and there was nobody in charge. And my daughter called me and she said, "Mom, you're not still going to the hospital, are you?" And I said, "Of course I'm going to the hospital." And she said, "But Mom, they're saying that the elderly," and like, heaven forbid I'm in the elderly group, "the elderly are at risk and you can't do this." And I had not given it a moment's thought. This is what I signed up for. I'm a doctor. I took an oath that I take seriously, that you're there to help people. And then my daughter called me back the other day or two, as she's in New York where people are dying. You know, they've got bodies lined up, piled up on top of each other in refrigerated trucks. You know, their situation was 2-3 weeks ahead of ours here in California. So we were looking at, this is where we could be in 3 weeks. And that's where my daughter was. And I was afraid for her and et cetera. And she called me, "Mom, you're not still going to the hospital, are you?" And then she said to me, "I'm going to stop speaking to you." And my family is very close. I'm very close with my children. She said, "I'm going to stop speaking with you if you continue to go." She said, "Let the young doctors do this." But again, it was a foreign concept as a physician, you know? So for 2 months maybe, I was not in the hospital. I wasn't coming to the hospital. And then when I did come to the hospital, you know, we had to wear a mask, you had to have your temperature taken, you had to attest that you didn't have any symptoms. And the first patient's room I went in, who had been identified as somebody with COVID, you know, I had to put on a hazmat suit and real an N95 and gloves and booties. And to switch your brain from thinking about how do you protect yourself versus what am I doing for this patient, put doctors in a position that you just weren't, we just hadn't really done that, you know. So it was very humbling, it was scary, and it's amazing that so many people got such good care. And it was wonderful when in the beginning, you know, you would see people in New York on their porches and they'd be clapping for the healthcare people because they knew those people were actually putting their lives on the line. And the switch, you know, last year, you know, doctors being told that they're giving people death sentences because they're suggesting that they take a vaccine. I mean, and you've spent your life, you know, or your professional life helping people and wanting to help people, and this is how the community responds was, I mean, it was a lot. So it's good to have your friends and your family who obviously can give you a different message. Yeah.
But
I mean, I think the heroism of the medical profession has not yet been appreciated enough in this country. And I'm just wondering, so what was it like in Los Angeles in terms of the African American community?
We have a lot of resistance to the vaccine. We have a lot of resistance to the reality that COVID is a disease. I spend at least 20-30 minutes daily maybe even longer, talking to people about how serious this is. And I mean, now we've been doing this for almost 3 years. You would think everybody would know it's a serious disease. But I think that given our experience, our being African American experience with, for instance, the Tuskegee, the, experiment,
Right.
that there is, and with just the tension and conflict that exists in so many communities around police and about government and about these things that affect our daily lives, that it's understandable how people could be reticent. It's understandable how people could be resistant, because this government has not been,
Can't trust
fair.
it. Can't
Yes,
trust it.
Can't trust it, exactly. I mean, there's, back in the 70s, 60s, crack cocaine was taking over, and the government didn't care about that. Now we have white people and an opioid crisis, and now people need to do something. Well, what about all those people who were on another drug? They were another color. So I understand. So as a physician, I'm just trying to give my best information to try to help people understand what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
Is there a lot of educational programs going on in those neighborhoods to convince people?
Well, there are organizations that are out there trying to, in churches that are trying to, that have taken it upon themselves to try to educate, and
Barbershops, maybe?
and yes, and people having discussions, and just this whole notion that it's much more likely that if somebody you know and trust tells you something, you're going to believe that more than if some random person on television tells you that.
But medicine and the African American community is another whole issue,
Yes.
isn't it? I mean, I don't know if you care to talk about it. I think it would be helpful to.
Well, I mean, there are many issues. I mean, and the one that I know more about is just infant mortality and black mothers, and so
The
that
rate
our
is what,
numbers,
3 times more?
well, in some studies, or it's even 4 times more. So that there are those who postulate that just being black in America brings with it medical problems. That it's not just access to care, it's not just education, it's not just those things. There's something that's happening to the black experience that then makes the body respond in a way that is
Is it
not good.
cumulative
It-
over the
it-
years,
we
over
don't-
the generations? We don't know.
It seems that is a reasonable hypothesis. Yes, I don't know that we know that.
I think there's more and more.
But I think
being
people are,
studied.
yes, and I think
Yes.
more and more people are at least willing to examine generational trauma, generational deficiency, and what is happening to all of us by the trauma that we witness on television, that we read about in the newspaper. I mean, it has to affect us, but we haven't studied that yet, and we certainly don't know how to fix that yet.
But, I really, my sister is a psychologist, and she was talking about this the other day, the cumulative aspect of violence and constant pressure and tension,
Yes.
anxiety.
Yes.
I mean, there's pretty clear evidence now. Maybe it's not all been done on African Americans.
Right.
Do you see what I'm
Yes,
saying?
yes.
But we have evidence on human beings, which everyone is a
Yes.
human being, I mean.
Yes.
And I think that is really an important area that I hope
Will be addressed.
that I really hope, because I think this is really important and significant.
You know, they've done some studies now of children. I can't remember what city the children may have been in Chicago, I'm not sure. But these are children who survived shootings in their neighborhoods or their schools. They were not the victims by the gun, but they were victims of the experience. Because let us not forget that the person who survives, even if you weren't in that place, but you read about it, you live near there, you have a cousin that went to that school, that affects you. And who knows what that is gonna, but they're beginning to study that.
Yeah. No, I think it's really important, and I'm interested more and more in reparations, and we've had some lectures and programs about it. And do you have any thoughts about that? I know it's a big area.
It is a big area,
I know.
yes.
I understand.
I mean, I think that the United States, as we know it today, would not be in the position it is or had been were it not for the labor of slaves. And so had they not been able to export the cotton and the tobacco and the sugar and the rice that the slaves, and I'm no historian, I'm just a regular old person. Yeah. But that if my ancestors were the foundation and rock for all of that happening in the United States, then it would seem to me that it is reasonable that reparations be provided. The question is how and who
right.
and what
Sure.
amount.
But there has to be some
but
form.
something
Yeah.
needs to happen, yes.
I was thinking, you mentioned cotton. Just cotton alone, really, the billions in present day
Yes,
equivalency.
yes,
You know, and it was all done with free labor.
yes, yes. And without machines.
And
I mean,
without machines.
someone's
Horrible.
hands bleeding
Horrible.
daily.
Horrible. No, I think that's a big area, but I think there's more being done, and I hope it keeps going in that direction.
Well, I'm encouraged, as you know, here in California, there was the
June's Beach?
Willa, yes, Willa
Yes,
and Charles
yes.
Beach.
Yeah.
Bruce.
Bruce,
was their
Bruce,
last
Bruce.
name. Yes,
What are
Bruce's
the
Beach.
first names?
Willa, her name was Willa.
Willa.
His name was Charles.
Charles, okay,
Yes,
Bruce,
yes.
okay, yeah. No, I was very happy to read
Yes.
that, yeah. What would you tell the younger generation of African Americans today about their situation, the way the country is going? What advice would you give them?
Well, I think that that we need to continue to be hopeful, and that because young people can come up with more creative ideas, and young people, as evidenced by all the young people who took to the street after George Floyd's murder, that young people are paying attention to what's happening. So I would encourage them to be engaged in the political process, to not sit on the sidelines, but to vote, you know, to be a participant. And that small things make a difference. That you may not, as one person, change the world, but if I do my little and you do your little and she and he and etc., at least this is what I believe, that then that's how you get a groundswell of change. And so I would encourage them to.
Are your children, how do they react to what's happening in terms of racism today?
I think it's harder for them to understand that even though racism exists, and even though they've heard stories from their grandparents and et cetera about racism, so that in a way it's like the same story, they are in a better position now than, let's say, their grandparents were. Although there are people who would argue that actually segregation was a, you know, if you look at Reconstruction and you look at the time when black people were living separately, but living well, that maybe that's better than integration. But I think my kids are embracing the fact that the world is the way it is, and that you need to find a way that you can have dialogue with people, that you need to be engaged, that this person's attitude about you is not going to change if you aren't engaging. You have to be willing to be in communication, and I think that's where they are. Both of them, though, have written letters and have joined, organizations that were trying to get out the vote and to be active. My son, even in COVID, and I was a little bit worried, was manning one of the voting booths in Pennsylvania. So they are, they're trying to be engaged, to be civically conscious.
Sure. Anything else you'd like to share? No?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you so much.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.